There were stories that never reached the newspapers, stories that no preacher dared to mention from the pulpit. They slipped between the cracks of history, carried not in ink but in whispers, traded by old men with tired eyes as they sat by the fire. These were the kind of tales that clung to the bones of the land, heavy as wet rope, impossible to shake off. They spoke of cruelty born not in the shadows of foreign wars but in backyards and barns, in the quiet corners where neighbors lived too close. Evil wore familiar faces there, the kind you might pass on the street without suspicion, and it festered behind closed doors where law and mercy rarely reached. Yet, within those same stories, there was something else, something sharper than the edge of a blade. Goodness existed, though not the soft kind sung about in hymns. It came hard, with grit under its nails and iron on its hip. It was the sort of goodness that did not ask permission, that did not wait for applause, that acted because no other choice remained. Out on the frontier, salvation was not gentle. It smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and dust, and it often left scars deeper than the wounds it healed. Those who carried such truths were never granted peace, for the fire that burned inside them was not meant to fade. Some souls, it seemed, had not been born for rest or comfort. They had been born for struggle, for the long ride into danger, for standing alone when silence would have been easier. And when the telling was done, when the embers of the story glowed low, the listener was left with a question that clung harder than any ghost. What would they have done, had it been them? The year was 1887, and the land around Pinyon Creek in Nevada baked beneath a merciless sun. The hills shimmered with heat, their outlines blurred and shifting like ghosts against the horizon. Dust hung in the air, fine and choking, coating skin and tongue alike. Even the birds had fallen silent, and the land seemed suspended in a long wreathless pause, as if waiting for something to stir. The cicadas buzzed faintly from the brush, the only reminder that life still clung stubbornly to this desolate stretch of earth. Elias Cole moved along a narrow trail that wound between the ridges. He led his horse rather than rode it, his boots sinking slightly into the dry soil with each step. The animal's ribs showed faintly beneath its hide, its movements slow and weary, but Elias did not urge it forward. He was a man carved out of long miles and hard labor, once a railroad worker who had seen tracks hammered across wilderness and towns rise where silence once reigned. His face carried the weight of both memory and solitude, eyes steady, fixed on the horizon as though he read more in the land than others could. He was not given to talk, and he carried silence the way others carried weapons. As the path curved around a stand of twisted juniper, something unnatural caught his eye. It lay half in shadow beneath the branches, a shape that did not belong among the rocks and thorn scrub. At first it looked like a bundle of cloth discarded by some passing traveler. He slowed, narrowing his gaze, the dust swirling faintly in the heat haze around him. Each step forward tightened the weight in his chest until he stood over it and understood. It was not cloth. It was a girl, young, perhaps no more than 19. Her body was small and brittle, as though the desert itself had begun to consume her. Scratches scored her legs, red and raw against pale skin, and her lips were cracked open from thirst. Strands of hair clung to her face in dark clumps, matted with dried blood. She did not move when his shadow fell across her. Her eyes opened just enough to reveal a hollow emptiness, vacant of both fear and hope. It was the look of someone who had gone past pain and into silence. Her chest rose faintly, each breath shallow and strained. Though her body told the story of torment, bruises, torn clothing, the weary tremble of her limbs, her expression remained still, almost resigned. The land around them seemed to grow heavier in that moment, the weight of heat and dust pressing down like a verdict. Elias stood motionless for a long while. He had seen the dead before, had watched men broken under the iron tracks of the rail lines and in the violence that lurked wherever money and power shifted hands. But there was something different in this still figure beneath the juniper, something that demanded choice rather than distance. He did not ask what had happened, did not demand answers the girl could not give. At last he shrugged off his worn coat and laid it across her thin frame, the gesture neither tender nor ceremonial, simply necessary. Then, with the same steady strength he had once used to lift steel and timber, he bent down and gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a wisp of a soul more than a body, and yet in that burden lay something greater than weight. Elias turned from the tree, high boots grinding against the dust, and began down the trail once more. It was not pity that drove him, nor duty, but the knowledge that leaving her there would have been the same as betrayal. Cole carried the girl across the barren stretch until the outline of his cabin appeared at the edge of the dry riverbed. The structure stood crooked against the land, built of rough-hewn logs, patched with boards that had long ago warped in the sun. The roof sagged slightly, and the single window held 2 planks nailed across where glass had once been. It was not much, but it kept out the wind in the dark. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, ash, and dust that never quite left no matter how often he swept. He set her down on the narrow cot pushed into the corner and left her for a moment while he fetched water from the barrel outside. When he returned, he held a tin cup steady as she drank, each swallow slow, as if her body no longer trusted the relief it was given. He placed a folded dress beside her, a simple piece of cloth that had once belonged to his sister before death claimed her in another season of hardship. There were no words between them. She took what was offered with hollow eyes in silence. The nights in that place came quickly. Shadows stretched across the walls as the sun sank behind the ridge, and the only light came from the fire crackling in the stone hearth. She sat near it, arms drawn close, eyes fixed on the flames but seeing little. When he set down food, beans and stale bread, she ate with careful, deliberate bites, as though each piece might be the last. Her hands trembled faintly, not from hunger but from the memory of hunger, a deeper thing that had taught her not to trust the presence of food. The cabin filled with quiet, but it was not a comfortable quiet. It pressed down like a weight, every creak of the boards and every sigh of the wind slipping through the cracks louder than they should have been. He busied himself with small tasks, stacking wood, cleaning the rifle, checking the roofline for leaks, but always aware of her presence in the corner, a fragile figure wrapped in borrowed cloth. Time passed in this uneasy rhythm. She slept fitfully the first nights, curling against the cot as though ready to flee if a sound broke the stillness. He did not approach, did not intrude, letting her carve out space where she could. On the third day, as the fire burned low and the light of dawn slipped through the crooked boards, she finally raised her head. Her voice was rough and used, and carried more weight than the words themselves. Her question hung in the dim air, raw and trembling. He stood across the room, eyes fixed on her, and the silence stretched until it seemed to shape itself into something heavier than speech. His answer came at last, carved out of stone and carried without flourish. She turned away afterward, but there was the faintest tremor in her lips, the kind that betrayed what tears could not. That night she no longer lay in the barn, no longer pressed herself against cold wood and straw. Instead, she stayed inside, by the fire. Wrapped in a blanket, her body sank toward rest, the flames casting long shadows against the cabin walls. Elias sat outside beneath the stars, listening to the coyotes cry across the hills, knowing that inside the cabin, for the first time, she slept without running. A week passed before Elias led the girl into Whitford, a small settlement that seemed more dust than timber. The town sat in a shallow basin, a cluster of weathered buildings leaning against the endless sky. One saloon with a warped sign, 3 stores with cracked windows, and a scattering of shacks stretched along a single road of churned dirt. Wagons rattled slowly past, horses snorted at the troughs, and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and whiskey. She walked close behind him, her eyes lowered to the ground, her steps cautious as though the earth itself might betray her. The townsfolk watched as they passed, their glances quick and measuring. No one spoke, but whispers followed in the silence they left behind. He bought flour, nails, and salt, stacking the goods carefully into the saddlebags. She lingered by the door, quiet, her hands folded tightly against her stomach. It was then that a figure appeared on the porch of the general store, a tall man with a wide frame and a face swollen red from drink and heat. His shirt hung loose, stained with liquor, and his grin spread without mirth. The stench of whiskey carried even in the open air, sharp and sour. He leaned against the post, his eyes narrowing on the girl, his presence heavier than the sun overhead. The sound that left his throat was laughter, but it lacked joy. It was the kind of laughter meant to cut, meant to remind others of debts unpaid and power unspoken. His gaze linked she were a possession misplaced, not a soul reclaimed. He spoke, and his words dripped with the weight of something unclean, a reminder of change she had not chosen. Elias did not question him, did not seek explanation or bargain. The silence stretched a heartbeat too long before his hand struck. The blow landed with the force of certainty, sending the man backward off the porch into the dust. The impact split his lip, blood spilling across his teeth as he coughed and spat into the dirt. Yet even there, sprawled on the ground, he smiled again, the curve of his mouth twisted with malice. His voice rose, sharp and defiant, carrying across the street so all could hear. He spoke of consequences, of ties stronger than fists, of a brother with a badge and a county at his back. His threat hung like smoke, promising retribution that would not wait long. The townsfolk watched from their doorways, silent, eyes darting away when Elias turned his head. The man's words sank deep, clinging to the air even as Elias helped the girl mount the horse. He gave no reply beyond the weight of his stare, no denial, no argument. Only the truth carried in the few words he cast into the dust before they rode out. They left Whitford with the supplies strapped tight and the horizon stretched wide, but the echo of that encounter followed them. The red-faced man's warning clung to their backs like dirt on worn boots, a shadow too stubborn to shake loose. The trail away from the town was silent, but it carried the heaviness of words that refused to be forgotten. That night Elias gathered what little he trusted to keep them alive. He packed cartridges wrapped in oiled cloth, strips of dried venison, and 2 coarse wool blankets worn thin at the edges. He did not touch the rest of the cabin. The chair remained by the hearth, the bed unmade, the tools leaning against the wall. He left it as it was, a shell to be swallowed again by dust and silence. When the last ember in the fire pulled, the trail into the Sierra country rose steep and narrow, climbing from the dry wash into ridges that cut the horizon like broken teeth. The air thinned and grew colder with each mile. By day, the sun burned against bare rock and brittle grass, yet when night fell the mountains turned harsh and sharp with frost. The cries of coyotes echoed across the canyons, and sometimes the distant call of wolves carried in the wind. Each sound pressed against the edges of their campfires, reminding them that the wilderness offered no mercy. The paths they followed crumbled beneath the hooves of the horses, loose shells scattering into ravines, leaving them to pick each step with care. But the silence of the mountains was still a kind of refuge, heavier but safer than waiting for riders to come down the road. Mary kept close to him, her eyes watching the shadows as if expecting them to move. Fear still lived in her, but it had changed shape. It no longer made her stumble or tremble. It had hardened, sharp and quiet, like the edge of a blade kept hidden until the moment it was drawn. On the 3rd day Elias found signs in the earth. Tracks pressed deep into the soil, too fresh to belong to wandering trappers, too deliberate to be accidents. They were being followed. 2 men, maybe 3, keeping their distance but steady in their pursuit. He said nothing, but from that moment on his shoulders carried the weight of knowing time no longer stretched wide. Every hour brought the chase closer. At night he slept in fragments, his body attuned to every whisper in the dark. The snap of a twig, the shift of wind, the distant call of an owl made him reach for his rifle before his eyes were fully open. He set traps along the narrow cuts in the trail, wire and rope hidden beneath pine needles. He checked them each dawn before they moved on, leading her through ravines where the stone walls rose like jagged knives, then across streams that ran shallow but icy against the skin. On the 4th night, the silence finally broke. From the brush came a scream, sudden and sharp, tearing through the darkness like the cry of some wounded beast. A man had been caught in the snare Elias had laid. The rope had whipped tight around his leg and dragged him down, snapping bone clean in the trap's grip. His wails echoed against the canyon walls, carrying far into the night until the sound seemed to multiply and return from every direction. Elias approached, rifle in hand, eyes steady in the firelight that spilled from their small camp. The man lay thrashing, his face pale with pain, breath shuddering through clenched teeth. Blood smeared his lips where he had bitten down against the agony. Elias stood over him, silent, the shadow of the mountains falling across them both. When the man lifted his head, There was no plea in his eyes, only defiance. The answer came not in words of confession but in a dark laugh choked with blood. He spat into the dirt, the red stain spreading in the dust, and grinned with the madness of one who carried secrets meant to stay buried. The sound of his laughter lingered long after the night fell quiet again, as though it belonged not to him alone but to the hunt itself, promising that more waited somewhere in the darkness. The canyon split the land into jagged walls of stone, its narrow floor littered with shale that broke underfoot with a sound too sharp in the stillness. As the evening settled, a hush hung in the air, but it was not the hush of peace. It was the kind that comes before thunder, a warning stretched thin. Then the first rifle cracked, its echo tumbling down the cliffs like a falling boulder. Another followed, then another, until the gorge roared with gunfire. Bullets hissed past, shattering against the rocks, throwing shards of stone into the air. Dust rose in choking waves, clouding vision, coating the tongue with grit and iron. Elias pressed Mary into the shadow of a cleft, his own body a shield against the onslaught. He could hear the men above shifting their positions, their boots scraping against the granite as they sought higher ground. They had planned this hunt, driving him into a place where retreat meant death. He understood then that running farther was no longer an option. The mountain had narrowed to a point where choice was stripped away. To stand was the only path left. The night stretched, broken by bursts of rifle fire that lit the darkness in flashes of orange flame. Smoke drifted across the rocks in thin fingers, carrying with it the stench of black powder. Elias crouched low, his rifle braced against the stone, firing back with measured calm. Each shot echoed through his bones, the recoil jarring his wounded shoulder, but he did not waver. Mary remained silent, her eyes wide, her face set in a stillness that spoke more of endurance than fear. Hours bled away. The stars shifted above, veiled by drifting smoke, while the cold of the mountains seeped into their bones. Elias moved like a shadow against the rocks, conserving each round, waiting for the faint glint of movement along the ridge before he answered with fire. He counted the echoes, the voices that shouted commands, the curses that followed when a shot went wide. Each sound painted the unseen battle in the dark. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the peaks, the canyon lay heavy with silence once more. The gunfire had ceased, leaving only the acrid bite of smoke clinging to the air. Dust floated in pale streams through the morning light, settling slowly onto the bodies sprawled in broken shapes among the stones. Elias stood in the midst of it, his shirt torn and dark with blood where a round had cut through his shoulder, his hands raw and red with powder and wounds. He drew a breath, slow and ragged, the weight of survival pressing down heavier than the bullets had. Around him the earth felt hushed, as if even the mountains bore witness to what had been done. Mary stepped from the shadows of the cleft, her gaze fixed on him, and though the dust swirled thick around them, her eyes did not blink. She saw not the man who had led her through the desert, but someone forged in violence, standing alive in a graveyard of stone and silence. The weeks that followed carried a different kind of silence. The gunfire had ended, the pursuit broken, yet the weight of it clung to the air as though the mountains themselves remembered every shot. Elias built a small shelter from fallen timber and salvaged boards taken from an abandoned line shack. It was crude and narrow, the roof uneven, but it stood firm against wind and rain. Mary worked beside him, her hands raw from digging post holes, her shoulders bent from lifting what little the land allowed them. The tasks were simple, yet in the rhythm of labor there was a quietness they had not known before. At night the fire burned low in the hearth, its glow soft against the rough walls. She no longer sat apart, no longer kept herself folded into corners. Instead she rested near the flames, her body wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. The shadows that had once haunted her eyes began to loosen their grip. Her silence was no longer hollow, it carried weight, the kind that speaks of endurance rather than fear. Elias, for his part, spoke little as ever, but his silence had changed as well. It was no longer the silence of a man alone. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline and the sky burned with the last light of day, she looked across the fire at him. The girl who had once lain broken beneath a juniper tree was gone. What remained was someone different, someone who had passed through fire and come out the other side. Elias saw it too, though he gave no speech, no gesture of revelation. He simply met her gaze, and in that quiet exchange the truth was set. Neither of them could return to what had been BF. Or, the land around them remained indifferent, vast and untamed, yet within that indifference they had carved out a corner of survival. No witnesses, no audience, no judgment but their own. Sometimes the world did not demand grand tales or victories. Sometimes it asked only that a man stand where others fled, that a woman rise where she had once been broken. Survival itself became its own testament. And so the story lingered, not in the clash of rifles or the blood on stone, but in the stillness that followed. It left a question in the air, one that refused to fade even as the fire burned low and the mountains settled back into silence. If it had been you who walked that trail, if it had been you who found her beneath the tree, what choice would you have made? Would you have turned away, letting the dust and sun finish what cruelty had begun? Or would you have stepped forward, knowing no one might ever see, no one might ever thank you, but God alone?